Good morning, dear friends. Welcome. It's Erev Shabbas Tes Tammuz, July 8th. We're here to study the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. And today we're grateful to dedicate our learning, Livlei Nishmas, Mindel Rivabas, Kalman Kalainabos, our dear Dr. Hammer's mother, Neshama Shavan Aliyah. And I'd like to express my gratitude to the doctor to honor his mother. He's dedicating this week's care packages that go out Baruch Hashem every week. And I am biased, but I think it's a wonderful tribute to the doctor's mother, and certainly conveys a legacy of love and giving that no doubt started, or at least was conveyed by the Difteres Mindel Riva Bas Kalanimus Kalman. And so it should be a beautiful big bracha for her, as well as we're going to dedicate our learning today. And just to share, we got a beautiful note in the mail, a lady who recently, a neighbor told us that she's alone, and so we started sending her an Erev Shabbos care package, and she writes about how she's a 90-plus-year-old woman living all alone, and she's knowledgeable in Yiddishkeit, which what I take is that she's very strongly identified as Jewish, but she's finding, this is my commentary, but she's finding herself Jewishly isolated, and she appreciates the Torah reading material and the food, and she sent a very sweet donation, and she writes the soup and the challah are so delicious, and the delivery person is Aisha's Chayil. And so what I read over here is, unfortunately, we have different kinds of people that are benefiting from these packages, some that are isolated and alone, some that are hungry, and some that are feeling spiritually detached from their people. And Baruch Hashem, we try to tackle all three angles: connection, feeding intellectual and emotional thirst, as well as literal hunger. And so I'm biased, but thank you, doctor, for dedicating the care packages, and Yasher Koyach, it should be a aliyah for your neshama, her neshama. And we shall have good news for all of the children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Gesund and Naches, again, Mindel Riva Bas Kalanimus Kalman, whose yard site is today. And now we'll share the screen, and with Hashem's help, we'll get right to our Torah, our Gemara study. And yes, I remember I owe a follow-up from yesterday, so let's share the screen and get started as soon as the Gemara. So, actually, no, we need to learn a little more Gemara, and then I'll give you the follow-up on the disposables. So long as here we go. So we are on one. I didn't say where we're holding. So we're holding Masechet Shabbos, the 17th chapter, Shiva Asar. And we're on page 125a, 125a, Kuf Chaf Hey, Amud Aleph. And the screen will almost be in sync with our subject of our studies. Here we go. Garbage, or things that are being disposed of. Let me just hold on. All right, I'm not finding here. Oh, here we go. Okay. Amar Bar Hamduri, Amar Shmuel, teaching from Bar Hamduri, the name of Shmuel. Kirumis Shamachzeles, shredded mats of reeds, mutter l'taltalam b'Shabbos, they are not muksa, they can be carried because they have utility on Shabbos. By taima, what use? What's the reason? Why aren't they muksa? They're broken. They're out of commission. More answers. Amarava, Bar Hamdure, Asbrale, the explanation that Bar Hamduri, who is the conveyor of this teaching, explained. Machzeles gufala maichazia, what do you do with the mat? Lichasui ba'afra, to cover up earth. The smaller scraps of mats also have an enduring utility to cover up. Let's read Rashi. Kromis shamachzelas shenifredu min machzelas yeshana. The part that split off, that broke off of an older mat. Bar Hamduri Asbrali, Bar Hamduri Purishly Tamesh Alava. So the student of Shmuel, who conveyed the teaching, gave the explanation. Afra, Oymed Lachasais Baitzaya. Could either be used to cover up literal refuse, something very unpleasant that needs to be covered on Shabbos, or it also can be used to keep the earth down. So this seems like possibly a primitive kind of flooring. Now, I would say that I struggle to visualize what these mats look like, but I'll tell you what I imagine it looks like. You know, the schach mats that we buy that nowadays you'll see. So they are made out of bamboo, but you can imagine, and sometimes you have them made out of reeds. So sometimes with a lot of time and passage and wear and tear, it does split off. And so you have like a little foot wide stretch of these mats. So it's not really great for schach, but in those days, it looks like it was used for some kind of flooring or something, and it could still be used for a smaller stretch. So therefore, Shmuel Paskins, it remains accessible, it remains not muksa, and that is the next halacha. We're talking about a scrap item that remains available and non-muksa because of its functionality. Next case, Amar Rav Zera Amar Rav. Zera said in the name of Rav, Shiyare Pruzmayot, remains of, Rabbi Steinsaltz says a cloak, which is probably the literal, which is the literal translation of a cloak. Asur litaltalam b'Shabbos, they may not be carried on Shabbos. So we're talking about scrap material that has shredded off of a garment. Rav says it cannot be carried. Why not? What do you mean, why not? Well, because we know that our Mishnah says that something that breaks or wears down, if there's a me'ain or ke'ain melacha, if there's another use, even if it's not the original use, it is not muksa.
Hello, Robin.
Abaye, so Abaye explains, Matloni is she'ein bein shalosh al shalosh. We're not talking about any.
I don't know. It just didn't happen.
We're not talking about any kind of scrap material. We're talking specifically about really small scraps. They don't even have 3 finger breadths by 3 finger breadths, an incredibly small little piece of material. Because at such a small size, no matter one's class or socioeconomic station, there is no use for such small pieces of material. What would a poor person do with this little garment, a 3x3? You can't quite wear anywhere. So I think you could use it as a patch. Now, interestingly, Rabbi Steinsaltz, probably by virtue of studying the etymology of the word in probably ancient Persian, pruzmayot. Pruzmayot means a cloak. Now, in the Steinsaltz Gemara, he gives a note, but sometimes he gives us the language from the Greek word perizoma, which means hips, a girdle worn around the loins or the garment placed around the thighs. So I guess in the original Greek, it wouldn't quite mean a cloak, but somehow from context, or it's close enough, it means an outer garment. To be honest, Rabbi Steinsaltz's explanation of the Greek word makes this translation harder to understand to me, but it does mean a cloak of sorts. Rashi says, talitot, a talis. Would you call it a cloak or a throw or a shawl or an outer garment? The Amar, the Sukkah, and indeed the Sukkah, in the Gemara Sukkah, it uses the word pirzima to describe a garment that ultimately carries techeles, and it's a tzitzis garment. Now, I do want to point out an important note. Today, and for the last, let's call it 1,000 years, maybe a little longer, Jews manufacture garments that are specifically called a talit, or maybe we call it a talit gadol, and it's a garment that's worn ritually as tzitzis, and we wear it primarily in shul. And if you go back far enough, at a certain point, I don't know if it's in the time of the Gemara, maybe the time of the Mishnah, maybe even a little bit before that, it seems like all or most of society's males, and maybe females too, wore a talis-like garment, but it wasn't ritual, it was a garment. And so I'm thinking of something that looks like a toga, right? A toga. Alan, would you say that a toga and a talis have something in common? No? Here, you're muted. You got to unmute so we can hear your...
I think a toga is a robe of some type.
But what is the raw appearance of a toga before you wrap it and put it on? I
No
think
idea.
it's a square.
It looks like a sheet.
It looks like a sheet. So it's maybe, I mean, we imagine the toga in a certain way, under one arm, over the other. But more broadly speaking, people, it seems like, would wear this outer throw, shawl, outer garment kind of thing. And so in the original concept, if I'm not mistaken, and I may be mistaken, but this is my understanding, a talis was not a hard thing to come by. Every person had a garment. That's what we would call a talis. If it had arba kanfois, if it had four corners as prescribed by the Torah, one would apply strings of tzitzis. At a certain point, society or the style changed. Style changes. Style doesn't just change today, but style always changed. Probably based on what the average adult human was doing would determine what the ideal form of clothing. Also, depending on what kind of materials are available and the latest technique of weaving or stitching. And at a certain point, I think we can all agree these toga cloak-like garments kind of fell out of style for the most part, and people started wearing different kinds of clothing. So I think already in the Roman era, you'll see less people wearing toga-like garments. So if I'm not mistaken, hold on. So once upon a time, a talis just meant a Jew attached strings, and they might have gone around all day with a talis, but they didn't look that strange because everyone wore a talis. If you're Jewish, if you're from, you had strings. So the question now that I'm asking, and it's a lengthy introduction, is what are we talking about here? Are we talking about just a regular cloak? Are we talking about a ritual cloak? So talis doesn't exclusively mean ritual, but I'm wondering here, based on Rashi's reading, if he does intend to mean something of a more ritual nature. Reb Errol, go ahead.
I have a different question. I don't accept that no matter how small that piece is, that it has no use.
Why not? Let's hear.
No, you have a tiny piece of cloth, something that might be loose. You put it could tighten it. I'm sure in our own group, give us 2 minutes. We'll give you plenty of things.
I'll tell you what comes to my mind immediately. I'll tell you what comes to my mind immediately. You could turn it into a wick.
Whatever.
Right? So, Reb Errol, you're thinking that I'm going to tell you this is a bad question. But that's only because you don't know me.
It's not the first time, not the last time.
It's not a bad question. Your question is asked by the Ravid on the subject. He says, I don't understand. Why stop at 3? Why are you only envisioning the use of this material in a clothing kind of context? Why don't you envision it as a shmata? You could put it to cover a small little schmutz or burn it as a wick. And so the Ravid actually says what I was asking, and I wasn't sure if I was going to explain it, but your question invites that. The Ravid says that we're talking about a ritual garment. A ritual talis, although we don't treat the garment of the talis, let's say, with the same degree of kedusha as tefillin, with a talis, if you cut off the strings, you can honorably discard the talis, the baguette, but it has to be treated with extra kavod. And therefore, it would be extremely inappropriate to use a literal talis as a shemata. And therefore, the only kind of use that we could envision here is to reincorporate it as a patch to a bigger talis or to another garment. And therefore, maybe it is that, not everyone says this. I don't think the Rambam agrees, but according to the Ravid, we're talking about only a talis, but other garments might actually have to, or could even be smaller. And now we might understand what's going on here in Rashi. Talisa is kedamar b'sukkah, Rama techilta. He uses an instance, a proof from an item that is actually possibly a talis, a ritual talis, and that might explain what's going on over here.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I have a different, a general question, not specific. We see here and in many, many places in Gemara, and one Rav says something in the name of another Rav. And we know in general, and then continues to explain
end.
what the other Rav said. People have a tendency to paraphrase. And here we're dealing with halachas that we learn halachas out of what this rabbi said in the name of another Rav. How do we really know what the other Rav said?
So I'll tell you, first of all, it's a good question. And we have in the Gemara evidence of occasionally the message being evolving or changing, but it would appear, and it would appear to me, based on the way the Gemara presents it, that there was a whole lot more effort to preserve the original language. Why do I say this? Because look how the Gemara presents the teaching. We had, and you're talking about this one, Baramduri quoted Shmuel, and he said, he said the exact line. And then he adds on, my timer, you want to know my explanation? And he gives an explanation. So the fact that this is a common structure where you have a student conveying a statement in the name of his teacher, and the commentary or the discussion only follows the end quote, leads me to, in addition to what's generally understood, but leads me to imagine over here that there was a whole lot of consideration about attempting to preserve the language. Now, is it perfect? No. And did we always understand the full context? No. And that's why there's a whole Gemara to keep us busy and to help us really try to go through these exercises and attempt to imagine what might have been the condition and the circumstance and the reason behind it. And was it exclusively all kinds of garments or any kind of garments? And just so, for example, over here, the word pruzmayot proves to be insightful, because even though it was just one of many words that I guess could have been used to refer to this garment, at least the way Rashi and the Ravid understand this, meaning the Ashkenazic scholars are reading here that this was bedafka, intending to convey that we're talking about a talus.
Rabbi,
Hold on, one second. Here, look in there. I just want to show you this inside the Rashba. Here, he discusses this Gemara and he goes through our thought process. Pirish shayare talisa, it's leftover or the residue, the remains of a talis. Abaya says they're not just worn out and like decommissioned garments. They didn't go to the thrift shop or they weren't dropped into one of those bins. We're talking about matlonias, really little scraps, shmatas that don't have shalosh shalosh. Nira mishum de pachas mikan einan ro'im klal. Stama adam zerk on the ashba. So the Rashba says his opinion first. Rebberal disagrees. But first, I want to say this is the opinion that Rebberal argued upon. He says, look, 3 by 3, it's garbage. Are there rare exceptions? Yes. But what is the general sentiment? It's garbage. And he actually quotes the Gemara earlier on that talks about wicks and describes, and we actually studied this Gemara. I'll tell you how I remember it. We didn't do a great job because I was away, and actually I didn't know it, but I actually had COVID, and I was trying to teach it to you from a hotel room. This is over a year now. It was January 2021. We learned this Gemara, I believe. But anyways, so it's so small, it doesn't really have a standard use. This is the opinion of the Rashba, and Rebberal strongly rejects it, and I join Rebberal in that insight. And so the Rashba knew that Rebberal is going to learn the Gemara 800 years later, or 800 years later. He's going to have a question. So he says, not to worry, the Rashba takes your point. The and it's got to be that we're talking about an absolute talis shal mitzvah, a ritual talis shal. You can't use it to cover shmutz. And based on the Ravid's understanding, if it was a random garment that was not a ritual talis, afilu mikan shari, afilu pachas mikan shari, so here you have it inside this dialogue in the interpretation
Rabbi,
of the Gemara. Yes?
Rabbi, the use of the word for cloak is important because you have Shnayim Ochsim Betalis. They know how to use a phrase when they want to.
Right. Well, I'll explain to you the difference. The Gemara, and this goes to Dr. Stamler's point, attempts to preserve the exact language. Imagine, let's say, Rebberal, when you were younger, if you would walk into the shul of the Beis Medrash and people were learning Gemara, they would probably be discussing it in Yiddish. Dr. Hammer, probably the same thing. If you would walk into the shul up there and you'd see 2 older people studying Gemara, probably they'd be using Yiddish. And then a generation or two past. I don't mean a generation, but I'm saying like the folks that were not the post-war crowd, and then maybe they learned in YU or who knows. Well, then they're going to be learning Gemara with a lot of English. And so although generally speaking, it's going to be the same idea, the language is going to be a little different. And so
today
the
in
Mishnah,
Montreal, it could well be French.
or Montreal could be in French, yeah. So the Mishnah was written in Eretz Yisrael, post, 100 years or so, in the 100 years that follow the fall of the Beis Hamikdash. And so the language is primarily Hebrew. The Chachamim, Rav, let's say, was in Bavel. I mean, he lived in Israel for a time, but he was in Bavel. And Rabbi Zera was probably quoting Rav from the time that he was in Bavel. And so they used the language that they were speaking there. It's possible, actually, based on Rabbi Steinzel saying that it's Greek, that maybe this was even the way they spoke in Israel, but that would be akin to the Jews of France learning Gemara in French. And so it's more probably an insight to the century that it was being discussed and the spoken language. And so, and I'll take it a step further. Dr. Hammer, so you would walk into a base measure somewhere over there and you'd have some guys, they just got out of the camps or a few years out of the camps, they're sitting in shul, they're learning Gemara, they're trying to teach in Hebrew school or who knows what. And they're using Yiddish. But some of the Yiddish would be sprinkled with Polish or Lithuanian or Russian because that was the Yiddish they spoke. Go to Montreal and Outremont or whatever, and they're learning Gemara in Yiddish, but they're going to sprinkle their Yiddish with French, because when they want to talk about a more contemporary fact that's not recorded in the Yiddish language, they'll have to borrow from French or English. And so I think that's, and you'll listen to that person, and it's mostly in Yiddish, but you'll know, oh, this person is probably from Canada, from Montreal. And the other person is what I mean. If you go to a shtibel in Yerushalayim and you listen to a Yerushalmi Yiddish speaker, they're going to sprinkle their Yiddish with Hebrew. And so, because when they want to be precise about contemporary facts, they're not going to rely on a word that came from Yiddish 100 years ago from who knows where.
Rabbi,
yes.
You mentioned before YU, quite interesting. My brother-in-law, who got smicha from YU in 1968, was sent for trials of proof in a couple of shuls because he was one of only 3 recent smicha guys who spoke Yiddish fluently. Nobody in the rest of the class could not go for these interviews because the shuls had requested someone who could give a drasha and speaks Yiddish fluently. He grew up on the Lower East Side, and that was his mama lashon with his parents and everything.
Fascinating.
So,
fascinating. Now I know the Rabbi Soloveitchik's shiurim until a certain point were in Yiddish, and then at a certain point I know he changed to English, and it was at the request of the Talmidim, because originally, even if you weren't from Europe or Eastern Europe, you picked it up by osmosis, and then at a certain point that became less.
Rabbi, we have a guy here who was brought up in the Caribbean, and he speaks Yiddish with that accent. It's impossible to keep a straight face.
Hold on, with a Caribbean accent or a Yiddish accent?
Yes.
I hope you'll find for us a sample, a recording of that accent. I would love to hear it.
Anything he says, we can't take him seriously because it's just so incongruous.
Does he have a lot of yas in his Yiddish?
Yeah, absolutely. You would close your eyes, you would say it's not even a white person speaking. Forget about Yiddish.
Very, very interesting.
I'll tell you, in Israel, interestingly, it's a little, I'm going to give you a different angle of it. The Israeli Arabs have an issue because they speak Arabic, but they sprinkle in Hebrew words into it. So when they go to speak in other countries, they throw in Hebrew words in the Arabic that they speak, let's say, when they go visit Jordan or Egypt or whatever. Quite interesting.
I mean, this in a way, I mean, I know this is of particular interest, I think, to us, because it's about our Jewish development of Jewish language. And then in the Gemara as well, here we have an instance, maybe I'm honing into carefully, but I believe this is also an interesting survey of the spoken language at the moment. And real scholars can actually say, yeah, this would have been, they could tell us exact region that this conversation would have happened or where their language would have come from, because there were dialects within the Persian Empire or within, the Roman or whatever you want to call, or eventually the Roman Empire. But I think it's the story in general of languages, which is that when you have a common family language, then they disperse. Over time, the language picks up new words, either to describe new phenomena or realities of their life, and it also adopts from other languages. And that's one of the ways I think they attempt to recreate ancient languages, is you'll look for the common words in the family groups, and that can give us a lot of insight about the reality of those people's lives.
Rabbi, one more remark on the subject. I had Alan Nadler for a Seder. He was head of YIVO at one point, and at the Seder, when we did Kol Noam, he said, I could tell you what village exactly your ancestors came from.
Which prayer is that?
In the Haggadah, Kilei Noah, Kilei Yoah.
The exact accent and the tune and the...
Yeah, no, from the accent. He said, I could tell you what village.
I believe it. So anyways, so this is, so that's really what's happening over here when he says Shiore Prozmoyes. He was probably quoting Rav. Rav was from Bavel. He came to Eretz Yisrael, and I believe he went back to Bavel. Rav Zera was from Bavel and then moved to Eretz Yisrael, but I don't know if they overlapped in Israel. And so it's an interesting, and so Abaya is back in Bavel discussing this with Rav Zera. And so they clarify, according to Abaya, it's very small garments. And some of the Rishonim say, yeah, Prismoyes is probably a language that's more specifically talking about a talis shel mitzvah. Just for curiosity's sake, I'm not going to blame this on the Rambam. They didn't link it, so we'll have to. We're not going to find it now, but Shulchan Aruch. Check this out. Shiri Matlonius. You want to see this whole sugya that we just discussed? Communicated in the Shulchan Aruch. Shiri Matlonius. So you have leftover, worn out garments. Shabalo that are worn out. If it has 3x3, it's not muksa. You can carry it because it has a utility. But if it has less than that, also it is prohibited. This is the simple reading of the Gemara. The Yesh Matirim, the Ravid, Rashi, others, or I shouldn't say Rashi, the Ravid and possibly Rashi, they say, you know what? This is Beryl's opinion. Even if it's less than 3x3, it's allowed to be carried. But that's only if it's not made out of a talis shel mitzvah. If it's a talis shel mitzvah, then it's muksa. So this little halacha, which you would read and we would just skim over, encapsulates the whole discussion we just had with the analysis of the language. And anyway, so interesting how many times, the Shulchan Aruch could be a nice insight into a broader conversation. Now let's stop here. I want to read for you. Let me just find it, because we had the question of disposable stuff. Because what's the rule? Something that is useful and usable, it is not muksa on Shabbos. You can use it for its purpose, unless you're a Nehemiah. But we're going to put a Nehemiah on this side. Something breaks. Our Gemara, our Mishnah, teaches that something that breaks, that's still usable. So, is it muksa? It's not muksa. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it has to have the same use. According to the Tanakama, any use. So that's something that's broken. What about if you throw something in the garbage? So Rav Papa explained yesterday that you would have to throw the item in the garbage before Shabbos. So then you've totally conveyed that it's garbage. What about a good garment that you threw in the garbage? It's not garbage. It's good. It's really a proper garment. So a cloak. And actually Tosfos, which we didn't really study, but Tosfos that I skimmed past, made that point. He says, the broken item, if you threw it in the garbage, is asur. But he says, we don't ask, what if you throw a garment in the garbage before Shabbos? He says, no, a garment never becomes muksa. A broken item that's barely useful, if you throw it out, you're showing that it's garbage. But a good garment is never garbage, which all of these teachings, all of these ideas lead us to a complicated question. Complicated question is chad pa'ami, one-time use, disposable. So what's the problem with disposable stuff? When you use it once, the manufacturer's intention is that you should throw it out. Common practice today, I believe, is that people throw it out. Are there people that wash stuff out or keep a cup?
Absolutely.
Certainly. Are there folks that put plastic disposable stuff in the dishwasher? I don't know, but knowing human beings, I'm sure there are some. So that's the question. The question now is, well, actually, it's two questions. Question one is, if something breaks nowadays, and the average reaction would be not to save it, what's the halacha? That's question number one. Broken item, the average person throws it out. Is it garbage?
Rabbi,
Yes.
you'd have the socioeconomic question here. There's
Yes.
some people who can't afford to keep, and they do wash them.
Right. Exactly. So that's the question. Do we look at the existence do we look at a less prevalent but existent reality, or do we look at the common and intended use? So he quotes here. Hold on. So the Balatanya writes, he's quoted here in the Mesifta. If you have a broken piece of cheres, whenever it breaks, if you can use it to cover a kli, you can carry it. Even if they don't have kalim around, for example, it's in the Shus Rabim, but being that it was available to cover a kli, you can carry it. And similarly with other broken kalim, and then he says this line. This is the line I want you to say. Elo sheshar kalim, yesh mohem she'ein shivreihem mutarim litaltal, elim keinhem g'dalim tzas. There are other kinds of kalim that when they break, you can only carry them if they are large enough to be useful. Aval einam ro'yim lechisei pichaves, aval pi shero'yim lechisei pikatan. If it's too small and it can only cover a small cup, the Balatanya says it's muksa because people don't usually use them to cover little dishes. A small piece of cheres. So basically, the Balatanya seems to differentiate between if it's actually going to be used commonly or not. So based on that, other Sfarim say nowadays we lose the heter of carrying a broken item because most people don't use broken items. And here we have a machlokes of the very, very contemporary poskim. So he quotes here the Goiner of Pinchas Scheinberg, who says there is no difference. Today, 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, the halacha remains the same. And we don't consider the immediate moment because things change and things could change. And he says, you think in the time of the Mishnah Berurah, for example, they also didn't throw away broken stuff. And yet he paskins that you can carry and hold on to that thing. So basically, long story short, we have a machlokes in the poskim. Some say we follow the halacha of the shulchan of the Gemara, notwithstanding the fact that today people are less inclined to hold on to those kelim. And therefore, if it's broken, but it could plausibly be used in the time of the Mishnah, it's not muksa. Other Sfarim say, other poskim say, no. Nowadays, if you're not likely to use that keli, it becomes muksa. So today, for example, you lose your bottle cap of water. You're not going to use a seashell. You're not going to put on some other kind of thing. It has to really be tight because our standard of storage is different. And so again, we have a machlokes about a broken keli. There are those who, based on a reading in the Balatanya, want to say that Bizman Hazeh we consider the style. Pinchas Scheinberg and others reading in the Mishnah Berurah say we don't make a difference. Other places can say we do. Now this question leads us to the next question, the question of disposable. Because we have the same question. Do we look at society standard, or do we say if we would take Rav Papa or Abaya, and we'd have a time machine, or Mashiach comes Tchias HaMeisim, and we'll show them disposable stuff. And we'll ask them, is this muksa on Shabbos? And they'll say, are you crazy? That's a cup. Cups are never muksa. Papa, we used it. We drank from it. So what? You wash it. You showed Papa a fork. So do we say that whatever they understood then, we apply that very sentiment, that idea today, or not? But the question in Eretz Yisrael was asked in a very interesting question. They asked, one of the most exciting things for a chutznik, especially the kids that come to Israel, one of the things that really excites us is the milk in the bags. Now, I think we're lucky. It's much easier to have your milk in a carton or to have your milk in a bottle. But as you show, they have the shoko in the bags, and you have to have a special pitcher. So when your shoko bag is empty, is it muksa? And so many places say, yeah, it's muksa. And if you want to throw it out, you can't pick it up. You have to turn over your pitcher, let it fall into the garbage, and then you can put in your new bag of shoko. Why? Even though you could use this plastic for another use, it's probably, to us today, it's considered garbage. And so, again, we have a similar machlokes. We have those who say that it's just like shivrei kelim. It can still be used, even if someone might use it. Until you put it in the garbage, you can always choose to reuse it. But others say, no. If it's chad pami, it's chad pami. You have to throw it out. So tachlis, what do? I don't know, but I'll just end with a tefillah. Hashem should help that we should always be as spoiled, and we should always take for granted that we can throw things out and there'll be more in the end of the thing or whatever. But it's an interesting halachic conundrum that could go both ways. Any thoughts on this matter before we?
We sell milk that way in Montreal.
I'm sorry.
Milk is sold in bags in Montreal.
Milk is sold in bags. Interesting.
Right.
We got to go to doctor.
About the situation where the broken pieces could be put together again, maybe with the help of glue or even without it, so that the kili might be used for its initial purpose or for another, like a decorative piece instead of holding milk or water. Obviously, it's not possible to do on Shabbos, but if this is the intended use of those pieces, does it mean they can be moved for this future purpose?
My understanding,
like putting in storage and for keeping them.
My understanding is that if it's broken and has no use on Shabbos, although it can and should be repaired after Shabbos, I believe it would remain muksa for Shabbos because it's not useful and there's no solution. Doctor?
Yeah, I mean, this is way out, but I understand Shabbos, it's muksa, and then whatever, recycling. So is that potentially a problem? I mean, you have trafe dishes, you have all sorts of trafe stuff that gets put into a recycling bin that's shared by whatever, a building, this and that, gets taken by a company, gets made into these new dishes that are now sold in amazing savings from
That's
China.
very interesting.
From China. So
you're saying, for example,
yeah,
you have an aluminum.
Right.
I'm trying to think of an example where you have an aluminum can of soup, which has little pieces of pork in it.
Yeah, big pieces. Even.
Big pieces of pork. And not only that, but the pork soup is cooked in the cans.
Right.
So it's really, really treif.
Right.
And now that pork,
what treif?
In order to reconstitute it, you have to melt it down.
Right. So I'm saying, so now you take the can and you send it to a recycling center, and they melt it down and they roll it out into new sheets, and then they sell Be'er Mayim Chayim seltzer cans.
Right.
So is that kosher? So I have to confess, first of all, I had never considered this. I think it's a very interesting question. I imagine the heat that makes the metal liquid again to be repoured into a new sheet of aluminum, coupled with its mixture with many other kinds of kalim, is probably sufficient heat to have removed the flavor. And then you have to consider bittul as well. But I believe we could probably envision another scenario where the recycled items are not melted down, but rather just, I don't know, crushed and then reformed into.
Water bottles are a good example, because I've been to simchas where, well, maybe you have it on a regular basis, where the water that we drink all the time and buy in Costco and buy wherever is not acceptable. That they have water that has a hashgacha, just plain water, 100% water, okay?
Right.
And so some people obviously hold by that's necessary, because it's not good enough to say that they wash them out and what temperature. They want to
Bernie,
be 100 min hamahad. Yeah.
it's not only water. Coca-Cola and all that are in recycled bottles.
Yeah, but I'm using water as an extreme example where most people don't go to the extent of saying, okay, it's water, it's acceptable.
But Rabbi, we had
Well,
this.
I just want to respond to the doctor. I believe under most circumstances it would not be a problem, but it would be interesting as an exercise to try to consider the scenario where it isn't processed with heat, and there's somehow you do have a piece of that original packaging available, and it would be an interesting question to consider. So I don't want to say this is the end of the discussion. We just have to be a little creative to find the hypothetical that will really keep us up at night.
Rabbi, we had this discussion before they certify something kosher. We had the question of how you open the thing on Shabbos. So the bottom line is, before they give a hechsher, they have to consider the packaging as well as the content.
Right.
Yeah.
At the end of the day.
This is true. And for example, did you know that today, like aluminum foil and parchment paper and all these things carry hechsherim? And I think those items, it may actually be necessary because some of these surfaces are coated with a schmear, and you want to make sure that that schmear is going to be 100% kosher because it comes in contact with actual food. So that is true. A hashgacha would consider the packaging. I don't know if they would give it the same rigid treatment as the food, but they would want to make sure that there's no animal byproducts or other substances that are considered not kosher.
Some of the ways of opening packaging, I'm sure, are a problem on Shabbos.
Oh, and then there's another issue, which I don't want to go into now, which is opening. You're saying how to open a keli on Shabbos.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With writing on it also, with writing.
Yeah. The classic issue, by the way, is opening a can of tuna, let's say, or cheese, whatever. So what's the problem? If you open it up, you're making a new kli. And so there's all that without giving out.
And then you have the cover. You have the cover.
Mamish, the cover of the keli is so that once you open the can of tuna, is the cover muksa? That's the question. But even before you open the can you open the can? Is there a special method to open the can? But I want to ask one other question, and I'm going to challenge you to. There's a big question, which is toilet paper on Shabbos. Can one tear toilet? And we're not going to get graphic over here. Don't worry. Can one tear toilet paper on Shabbos? So there are many families, households, that if they don't use tissues or something that's pre-cut, they will have a part of their Erev Shabbos ritual is to pre-tear toilet paper so that no one has to tear it. The question is, why might one not be allowed to tear toilet paper? And is there any clue in our Gemara to this prohibition or to this problem?
Yeah, well, it's tearing. It's tearing.
So I'll tell you, this is not the place that it's discussed, but we had over here a teaching that says like this. I must have gone too far. Hold on. Yeah. Lo yisvot mimenu shaver lechasot ba. You can't break a shard from it to make it good. You can't break it to be the right dimensions. as Rashi explains, Yitakein lahatir b'litotav. So here we're talking obviously about a piece of earthenware that's otherwise disposed, and it's almost perfect to cover another thing, but it's just got something pointing out. You can't break it. But there are those who say that the reason not to tear toilet paper is because you're being mitaken kli. You're forming the correct size and dimensions of this paper. So again, I'm not here to give you a psak, but this might be one place where we would have a clue to this question in our Gemara.
But Rabbi, getting back to the metal,
Yes.
Pots and pans or anything that's recycled, it's broken up into pieces. It's heated over a very, very high temperature until the whole thing melts, and then it's sorted out, and then it's reformed into something else.
Right.
But the same thing when we want to kosher an oven, we just put a torch to it.
Okay.
So why shouldn't this be good?
Because we're only considering immediately useful functions. We're not talking, is it ever useful? We're talking about, can you use the item as it is right now on Shabbos? The answer is yes, then it's not muksa. But if the answer is no, it remains off limits until after Shabbos, which of course, then ideally we should make the effort to modify the item and preserve it and preserve the environment. And it's also an economically sound policy and an eco-friendly policy. But if it's not available and accessible on Shabbos, that's not something that one could do on Shabbos proper. So that is that. Really fast. Let's find the Gemara that we were at. I zoomed.
We went from rags to riches.
Something like that. It's interesting. The Gemara asked, "Machzelas l'may chazi." What can you do with machzelas? And the Gemara answered, "You can use it to cover shmutz."
Right.
It sounds like we're saying that it has to be available for the original use. But didn't we say that it can also be used for a different use? So Tosfos says, yeah, you're right. But once we were talking, we wanted to figure out what it's useful. Others, others say, the Rashba says that the machzelas, these mats are particularly not valuable. And so if it wasn't useful in a most immediate way, it would be considered garbage. All right, now let's start a new Gemara. Well, not a new Gemara. It's a related Gemara about broken stuff. It's just a new item that will, of course, warrant some new explanations. Let me just see if we have some pictures here before we start. No. Nope. No cigar. All right, here we go. Taner Rabbanan. Shivrei Tanur Yashan. The shards of an old oven. Now, if I was going to ask you, what do you think an old oven is? You'll say, oh, Rabbi, if they were digging in Masada and they found an oven, that's an old oven. So, of course, here we're going to use a little bit of a different definition. What's an old oven? Rashi. Shekfar husak, that it was ever turned on. It was ever fired up. Because once the oven, which was made out of this clay form, once it was fired up one time, it hardens, and now that it breaks, we can put those pieces of shards to use. What use?
I was presuming that ovens were built into a wall or whatever. They had movable ovens.
So it would appear that in the time of the Gemara, most ovens were not in the house, not in the kitchen. It was some kind of structure that contained the heat. I would say it's not precisely like, but remember we once looked up the Bukharian tandoor, I think it's called, or Indian oven.
You
Remember
see them today also, they're called taboon.
Yeah.
Tandoor or here. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Here. So tandoor, which sounds very similar to the word tanor, right?
Yeah.
It's the external ovens. You fire up with fuel. And so I believe that's it's something akin to that we're discussing. So it was made out of clay, and once you fire it up once, it becomes very strong and solid, and now its shards are good materials for other uses. Not material, good stuff to use. Divi Rabbi Meir, this is what Rabbi Meir says. Rabbi Meir says, a tanor, an oven, its shards are not muksa, they're useful. I'm sorry? No. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Eini Tanor. Rabbi Yehuda says no. They cannot be used. Rashi, Harihen Kechol HaKelim, L'kamei Mefarish Pluktayo V'tamayo. So the Gemara is going to try to dig deep and understand what really is the essence of the debate. Hey, Rabbi Yossi, Mishum Rabbi Elazar Bar Yaakov. Rabbi Yossi gave testimony or conveyed testimony in the name of Elazar ben Yaakov, Al Shivrei Tanur Yashan, about a broken shard of an old oven. Shenitolam Shabbos, that they paskin you could use it. Ve'al Kisuyoy she'enoi tzarich beis yad. And as far as its cover, it doesn't need to have the handle on it for it to be considered a keli. Let's read Rashi and then we can try to discuss. Al Kisuyav, Shel Tanur. She'enoi tzarich beis yad. The belav beis achiza metaltali. Even without a handle, it's carried. Basically, there is a machlokes if a cover to be useful needs a handle. Now, I'm thinking realistically about even a pot that we use today, although this is not talking about a pot, but I'm thinking about a pot that you cover. And every pot I've ever seen that has a cover has a handle. Because if it doesn't have a handle, you're going to have a very hard time to remove it, particularly when there are very high degrees of heat. And so without really understanding the depth of the machlokes, we understand that it might be important to have a handle, and we understand that it would be a little bit of a chiddush to say that even absent a handle, it would still be considered, it would be considered a keli. Now let's go back just for a moment. The Brisa says, "Harehim kechol hakelim hanitolim b'chatzar." It's just like any other keli, and it can be carried in the chatzar. Tosfos right away tells us, FYI, there are different opinions about if something is not muksa, where it can be carried. So although the form of the brisa is referring to the opinion that says that a shivrei keli can only be used in the chatzar, remember, he reminds us that Rav Nachman would say it's permissible, or Rav Nachman and Rava have more expansive and permissive viewpoints. So Tosfos just brings that to our attention. But now, again, a machlokes, if you can or cannot use the shards of a broken oven that was fired up once, and the discussion about handleless oven covers. Now the Gemara is going to give its analysis. But my komifli, let's understand what they are really arguing. What is the halachic theory behind the debate? Amar Abaya proposes the machlokes should be just like our Mishnah. The debate is, does the item need to be used for its original use or any use? If you say it could be used for any use, well, the oven that broke, now you use those shards for other purposes. It's not muksa. But if you say it has to be used for the original intended use, well, my dear friends, a broken oven is incredibly not useful as an oven. And therefore, maybe that's why it's muksa. Let's read Rashi. The only reason Rashi, or no, this is Tyson, I'm sorry. Tyson points out that why do we use the word tanar? We could talk about any keli and use the same issue. So he says there's a chiddush. The chiddush is that an unfired up tanur, its shards are very unuseful because it's still too soft to be useful. So the chiddush of it is the unfired up oven. But the principle is essentially a very familiar one. It's the machlokes of Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. But as the Rabbi Yehuda letamei, Rabbi Yehuda is consistent with his reasoning, which is it needs to be available for the original use. Rabbi Meir letamei, and Rabbi Meir follows the opinion that he was part of in the Mishnah of the Tanna Kama that says that any use is available. And so now, by the way, we have a little clue. Until now, we didn't know the name of the Tanna Kama. But this as a side note, appears to be giving us a clue to the identity of the anonymous embraced opinion of the Mishnah, the opinion of the Tanna Kama. Now let's continue the Gemara. So this was Abaya's explanation. Abaya says, a debate about an oven, it fits beautifully with Rabbi Yehuda and the Tanna Kama of our Mishnah. Maskiv l'Rava, Rava doesn't agree. As we know, sometimes on rare occasion, Abaya and Rava have different viewpoints, and they're not afraid to share them. It's because this debate allows us to understand with greater depth the halachic matter and come to greater clarity. Maskiv l'Rava, Rava challenges this explanation vigorously. If you're telling me that the debate has to do with original use or any use, why are we talking about an oven? Let's talk about any kind of keli. Lipal gubishivre kelim ba'alma, talk about any kind of keli. I think Tosfos gave an answer, but I don't know. So Rava makes a good point. It sounds like there's something more precise that's being debated, not simply what kind of use is available to it. Ela Amar Rava. Rava clarifies the debate in a different light. B'shivrei dehai taner kamiflugi. They're debating about a very precise and specific issue of ovens. Rashi, ha'asay ke'ein zeh shoshani b'mishnah. They're arguing about an oven that is created in the form of the following text, which we're about to read. V'tanan, here is a Mishnah that says like this: Nisano al piabar, al piadus, v'nasan sham even. You have an oven. Let's read Rav Steinsaltz. We're talking about a clay oven that is not attached to the ground with mortar, cement, which is the standard. Rather, it's placed over the mouth of a pit, over the mouth of a cistern, and he puts a little stone there to hold it in place. Again, Nasna al piabar. So we're talking about a cylinder-shaped clay vessel. Most ovens have a bottom and a cylinder, or maybe it's tipped on its side, but right now we're imagining that the oven is this kind of round stove-like item. The fire is inside, and you put the pot or the keli either on top or you dip it into the fire. If it's a bottom, it's an open bottom, and you place it over a pit or over a ditch, and you place a stone to hold it in place. Rabbi Yehuda says, "A masik milamata, unisik milamaila." If you fire it up on the bottom in the pit, but the fire, the heat engulfs the entire oven, Tomei, now it is considered a ready and fully formed keli. The imlav tahar, but if the fire doesn't completely leap through the entire thing, it is not an oven and it's tahar. The Chacham say no. I don't care if it was perfectly fired up, so long as the flame went forth, it is kosher. Now we're going to stop here, and we're leaving really in a sense in a cliffhanger. We don't have full clarity. Bli neder on Monday, when we're going to resume the Gemara at 9:30. This week is the trial week. We're going to do Gemara 9:30 to 10:30. Bli neder, I will start off. I'll show you some pictures that I found in the Art Scroll Gemara, so we'll be able to visualize it, and we'll continue our discussion about ovens and broken ovens, and in fairly short order, with Hashem's help, we'll find a relatable relevance to this discussion. And so, my dear friends, I want to close with wishing everyone, all the dear members of our Chabura, good Shabbos. We pray and hope for good news for everyone. And again, I want to mention Yartzeit, the Neshama of Mindel Riva Bas Kalman Kloinimus, whose Yartzeit is today, Neshama Shem Aliyah. And again, thank you to the Hammers for spreading love to honor the Neshama and to continue her legacy.
Yes, Shakar, good Shabbos.
Oh yeah, good Shabbos. Again, I hope to see everybody on Monday, 9:30.
Okay, for me, it's better because I have the full hour. Perfect.
Givaldic. Okay, very
My
well.
Monday problem.
This week will be a trial, and we'll collect all feedback. Monday.
Good Shabbos.
Shabbos Koyach, everyone.
Shabbos.
Shabbat shalom. Yeshua.